Russia's attack on Ukraine has opened up Western media and journalists to accusations of bias and racism over their reporting of Ukrainian refugees compared to other emergencies or conflicts which have created mostly non-white refugees. Is it subconscious bias and tribalism that means some lives are more valuable than others? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Martin Stamford. Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine and the subsequent humanitarian crisis has rightly led news bulletins around the world. But not all conflicts have had 24-hour wall-to-wall coverage, raising accusations of bias. Is media coverage undermining trust among people of colour and marginalised groups? Many people believe it is, and even some experienced broadcasters have been called out for the way they've covered the conflict.
What's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
Well, that's just a few examples, but the way this war is reported matters because it shapes the perception of the audience, especially when it comes to the way we report about migrants. Well, let's bring in our panel. From the Scottish border town of Jedburgh, Yvonne Ridley joins us, the journalist and author who was captured by the Taliban in 2001. In London, we're joined by Professor Patrick Vernon, OBE, a cultural historian and social commentator. And with me in the studio is Humphrey Hawksley, one-time foreign affairs correspondent for the BBC, nowadays an author and still an expert voice on world affairs. Welcome to you all. Yvonne, let me start with you. Do you think there is a difference in the way the war between Russia and Ukraine has been reported when we compare it to other conflicts around the world?
Absolutely. At the moment, we're getting it wall to wall on our TV screens, but we rarely hear about Yemen, which is in turmoil. The coverage of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan was not as intensive as it is in Ukraine today.
Do you have a theory why that is?
Well, Europe is probably more accessible to Western media stations, but the style of coverage is quite different. It's much more sensitive. It's more gentle. It's not as graphic.
Patrick Vernon, would you agree with that observation, that we are being more sensitive as Western journalists and Western media in our coverage of this war?
Absolutely. Not only this war, but a whole other number of conflicts and just general reporting, even when it comes to fatalities. When it comes to black and brown people and bodies, you see explicitly in media death, suffering. You will hardly see a white person graphically displayed where children are dying, children, it just reflects, unfortunately, the nature of structural racism and global discrimination of people who are basically non-Western.
And you would blame an institutional racism then within the media as a whole to make those editorial decisions when they decide what pictures are suitable to be shown and what are not?
Of course, because they are playing to the gallery of audiences. So people in Stuttgart, the Cotswolds, or in rural France, they aim at those particular audiences. So anything that sensationalizes white people's death and suffering, there'll be outrage. Whereas when it comes to the issues of people from the Middle East, Africans, or anyone who is not seen as white, it's different. What's interesting about this particular conflict, it reminds me of what was happening in Serbia back in the 1990s, where again there was extensive reporting, and there's a distinction between who is a deserving refugee. The Ukrainians are seen as more deserving refugee compared to other people, and the media reporting has not even covered the discrimination that is taking place in the middle of a war conflict against African students, Caribbean students, people from India, and parts of the Middle East who are being left behind in this conflict.
There have been certainly some incidents reported at the border, haven't there, where transport was free and available to some Ukrainian refugees, but others found it more difficult. Just on this phenomenon of why the story's got such prominence, Humphrey Hawksley, have you struggled to sell the idea of a story in Africa or other less covered parts of the world to an editor?
Yes, I mean, throughout my career, there is always this sort of thing, and there's that old newsroom joke, it's a bit of a sick joke, is a ferry's drowned, who are they? 30 English or white people represent 3,000 Bangladeshis. I mean, that's a raw joke, but it's a sort of truth in a way, and that is what puts this forward here. But I think that it's much more nuanced than what we've heard. I mean, firstly, I have covered Iraq, Kosovo, Bosnia, numerous pretty unknown wars and killings out in the Philippines and Asia and places like that. Each time that has been a lead story, the suffering has got on there. So the child that comes from the hospital that has been bombed has as much prominence if the story has that prominence, as opposed to this one. Here we've got a different type of story. It's the United States, essentially, and Europe against Russia. Nuclear has been mentioned, and as Yvonne said, it is accessible. So there are a number of elements that go into that, and I think the reporting on the ground, particularly with my colleagues there, is no different to if they were in Africa or India. And what I would like to see, and I don't have knowledge of, is that as opposed to some of the Iraq war and that, you have a myriad of television stations from different countries out there. So the Indians are there, the Africans are there, the South Asians, the Africans are there, the Japanese are there, the Chinese are there. In fact, there's a colleague of mine from the BBC that is reporting for the Chinese now, a bit like we're sitting here on TRT. So I suspect that for those journalists reporting on the ground, it is no different. They are reporting back, but the Indians that Patrick mentioned, the Indians and the Nigerians that are not getting through, that is going to get prominence on their televisions, whereas what Europe's doing, what Britain's doing, is going to get prominence on our televisions.
Patrick, can I just explore the nuclear side of this, and let's dismiss it if it needs to be dismissed. I mentioned the nuclear concern here is that Russia is a nuclear power. America, Britain, of course, are as well. And this is therefore takes this conflict potentially to a very, very serious place very quickly. Is that a reason why it's covered in the way it is?
No, well, look what happened in Afghanistan. You had America, you had Russia in Afghanistan. They were both nuclear powers. The difference is that the Afghanis' lives are not as valuable compared to the Ukrainian lives. That's the difference.
Just explain a bit more why you believe that to be the case.
Well, I think it's just a history of globalization, a history of empire, colonization, that lens still influences even today in our kind of high-tech, multicultural world of social media. If you remove those infrastructures, the basic essence is that it's like the West is important. If you're a Westerner, your lives are 10 times more valuable than any other lives in the world. That's reflected in the power relationships, and the media is part of that process. You will get the odd exception. I mean, the odd exception was the murder of George Floyd nearly 2 years ago. that was a rare exception where that was internationally covered globally about the murder of an African-American male. But that is an exception. But when it comes to conflicts of war, the perception, and usually when it's reported in Africa and the Far East, it's always reported as if it's self-inflicted, without looking at those international power relationships which play a key role in these conflicts, to be quite honest.
Yvonne Ridley, let me just ask you about that question about the Afghan life being less valuable, perhaps, than a Ukrainian life. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And, you know, I have to slightly disagree with Humphrey, because the language used by some Western media commentators has been quite alarming. There are those that have expressed surprise that the sort of death, destruction and carnage we witness in the Middle East and Africa, i.e. the non-white world, is taking place in civilized Europe. And I did that irritating quote thing because that is what some media commentators actually said. You know, we are in civilized Europe. And one journalist said, I am choosing my words carefully. I thought, really? It's clear to me that what we are seeing are some, not all, but some white journalists who are not fully in control of what they're saying or thinking. In other words, we're getting their subconscious views. And I'm sure that they would be shocked and horrified by me saying that, but it is casual racism.
Well, let me cite one quote here from Ukraine's deputy chief prosecutor, who told BBC News, and this is the quote he used, "It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed." Humphrey Hawksley, to what extent, when editors, when journalists give prominence to this story versus another, to this conflict versus any other, are they just reflecting what the audience expects them to do? And therefore, as an audience, we are perhaps racist. We prefer to see stories about people who look more like us.
Well, I think there's an element of that. I mean, when I was looking at the pictures coming out of Ukraine, and you can imagine, you know, a Boots and a Tesco's and WH Smith High Street in London, and people dressed like it. That is that. I mean, racism is a very strong word to use on this, because it implies all sorts of things that Patrick alluded to. And I think it's quite a dangerous path to go down. We're not going to be able to change the way editors do this. To give you an example that's outside of this remit, when I was the Beijing correspondent for the BBC in China, I could get nothing on air unless it mentioned human rights. And I kept trying to say, look, they're building skyscrapers, they're building high street, you know, people are getting mortgages on flats and all that. They were not interested. And what Yvonne says about Yemen and about Afghanistan and all that, but actually, if you look at those wars, Europe is the savage continent. It has never stopped fighting. It has never stopped killing each other. The quote that you just gave us about him being surprised about that, it's not, because that's what we do in Europe, and America comes and bails us out. If Afghanistan, swathes of Africa, the Middle East, all of the conflicts there have got a Western involvement in them. If you take the West out of it, and I have reported on this from Asia a number of times, you probably don't get a war. So we are talking about, you know, when we talk about this implicit racism thing or whatever, we're talking about where the West has gone into places. The West went into Afghanistan, Russia went into, Soviet went into Afghanistan, the West went into Iraq, the West did Libya, the West encouraged Egypt, and all of this stuff. So I think it's a far more complex, nuanced tapestry, quite an ugly one. And if you bring racism into it, it gets very too simplistic, I think.
Let me just bring in some data here about the sort of people that work in journalism. Look, I'm only too conscious that I'm sitting next to Humphrey, who's a white man, and I'm a white man hosting this particular program. So we are part of these statistics. But some work was done at the City University in London about the news professionals, and they found that 94% of them were white, 86% of them were university educated, 55% of them were male. Only 0.4% professed to come from the Muslim faith, and 0.2% are black. I mean, to my mind, that's quite a shocking statistic. I must have worked at atypical places, because I think I've had quite a few colleagues. But do you think, Patrick, that is one of the problems, that the journalistic profession or the news media profession is still so dominated predominantly by white people that these phenomena, this is why this skewed reporting happens?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not even a conscious bias, it's explicit bias. And when you say, oh, if you talk about race, you're simplifying things. Let's get simple. It is about racism. You have a very narrow mindset and a narrow worldview. I mean, for example, over the last 18 months, since the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, every single broadcaster have made a commitment and a pledge around having more diverse staff in front of the camera as well as behind the camera. Sky News have made pledges of giving millions of pounds around a whole range of initiatives. The BBC itself has made a commitment of spending over £1 billion over the next 5 to 10 years around diversifying, not just around issues around race, but also LGBT and disability. Every single broadcaster has made its commitment, but it's not reflected in news reporting still. And this is the contradiction that we have. It's nice to make platitudes about we're tackling structural sexism, racism. It's not reflected in the reporting, because the reporting of news stories and the selective use of news items for what's important is still a big issue. So, for example, when you look at issues around, in the UK particularly, around women and who faced, there were 2 black women that were murdered in a park in North London. Very little reporting compared to someone like Sarah Everard. So there was still, even in the issues in the UK around reporting of issues around gender, there was still a difference between how it's reported. The sad thing about this conflict, it reinforces that worldview that white lives matter and black lives do not matter. And that's been the history of the last 400 years of Western civilization.
I wonder, Yvonne, is there a degree of simplicity about all this too, that we need a simple story? So in Ukraine, we have good guys, everyone else, bad guy, Putin. If we look at some of the more complex battles that have been going on for years, you alluded to Yemen earlier on, we either don't understand or choose not to understand the various factions and the various power at play there. It's almost like it's too much for us.
Well, I've often said it's down to lazy journalism. And you mentioned Yemen, and every time I think of that conflict, I think of the cameras going into hospitals and being really intrusive, capturing moments that really are too graphic. But because it's Yemen, it's okay to show on British television, but these images would certainly never be shown from the Ukraine. I'm talking about babies dying in maternity wards in front of the camera as the cameraman is filming, and the raw grief of the mother being exposed. And this would never happen in a European hospital. And, people are dying in Ukraine, but we're not seeing Western camera crews charging into hospitals and recording the very moments of death or recording the grief on the faces of the Ukrainians. So why is it seemed permissible to do this in places like Somalia or Yemen and elsewhere in the Middle East and Asia, but not in Ukraine?
I mean, Humphrey Hawksley, there are very different tastes, if you like, aren't there? And I hesitate to use the word standards, but approaches to news reporting. I think, speaking from the United Kingdom, where we're recording this programme, there is a habit, there is a practice where we don't show the point of death of anybody in a news programme. Colleagues elsewhere in the world don't have those rules. They quite willingly show maimed or dead bodies or the moment when somebody dies.
Yes, I think there is, and it's really interesting hearing this, because I think a lot of it's got to do with how the politicians react, because you've got to remember there's what's happening on the ground, There's the audience that the papers and the ratings are looking for. And there's also what the politicians are saying about something. So in this particular story, the political voices are very high, whereas in Yemen, the political voices are very low. And I think, you and I, we've been in places where I've tried to get stuff noticed. I did a lot of work on child slavery in the west coast of Africa during the Ivorian Civil War. Could I get that to play? No. Although we're eating Nestle chocolate all the time and that sort of thing, and it's been in the course, you can't. So in order to punch through and get that put onto the order sheet of the news programs, you need stuff on the ground, you need the political voices, you need the reaction from the public, and the other sad, sick joke they have in the newsroom that I mentioned about the Bangladesh ferry is if it's a single dog or puppy that's lost, that's the headline, and everybody's interested in it.
And that's just the way journalism works, is it? We can't really hope to change that.
I think it changes very, very slowly. As Patrick was talking about the diversity issues and I've been through huge changes in the way we report things and the balance and all the rest of it. But it's incremental. It's not going to change overnight.
Let's just hear some words from President Andrzej Duda, the Polish president, who's been speaking about this, particularly about the refugee and how much their plight has been reported.
Poland stands in solidarity with Ukraine, and we will do everything to help in this difficult situation, both here and in the rest of Poland.
And Patrick, let me just ask you about the reporting of the refugee problem. I mean, you alluded to this a little earlier in our programme, that some of the refugees, most of the refugees are white people, some aren't. They are encountering different levels of welcome at the border.
Well, definitely. I mean, I've heard direct from people, from various contacts, that people are trying to get to Poland. They're not allowed to go into Poland. And if they do go into Poland, the racism that they're experiencing is unbelievable. Some people are now going via Hungary into Germany as a more safer route. So, and obviously in the UK, we've made a pledge, the government's made a pledge of getting 100,000 refugees, Ukrainian refugees, but I think nothing's been put in place even to support them. The issue around refugees is interesting because if you compare that, what's been happening over the last 3-4 years, where people have left Libya, North Africa, because of conflict and the Western involvement, and people have made a treacherous journey across the Mediterranean to Europe, and they're either in the camps in Calais, or they've been left to die in sea. That one, I can't see that happen with Ukrainian refugees. If you're a white refugee, you're not going to be treated in that same way compared to people coming from the Middle East or Africa. There is a clear difference. And people can see that. We can see there's a clear difference in treatment, the language, the way the communication is. The very fact that this government has automatically said 100,000, but yet they will not even recognize child refugees coming from the Middle East or Africa, tells you all you need to know.
Yvonne Ridley, can I just ask you about this particular conflict, which, of course, it's completely false to say it started this year. This particular phase of it started 8 years ago in 2014 when Crimea was annexed. I would be happy to admit I don't think there was anything like the level of coverage to the Crimea invasion by Russia at that time. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think it's the kind of slanted and racist media coverage that we're seeing today. It is serving the Western narrative to say all things Russia bad, whereas at that time, 8 years ago, parts of Europe were trying to reach out to Russia, to make friends with Russia. We had oligarchs getting amazing access in Westminster, which has led to some embarrassed faces in Westminster today. So the attitude 8 years ago was quite different. Russia was fine, we should reach out, unlike today.
Do you agree with that, Humphrey, that for some reason this was almost an internal Russia-Ukraine matter and the rest of us didn't really need to pay attention to Crimea?
There was quite a lot of coverage. There wasn't death and destruction, though. So when this one happened, it was suddenly ramping up many, many levels, because you have the nuclear issue we've discussed, you have the Cold War, the US, NATO directly against Russia, apart from this buffer state of Ukraine. You have the corruption coming out, and we must remember it just came on the back of the Partygate issue and the lies from the Tory government. So you've got a sort of confluence of issues here that have exploded into this dreadful war that's bringing back images of Bosnia and Kosovo and that sort of thing. People, and as I said, people talk about a war in Europe. Europe is the place where the wars happen, and it's the place where the most of the killing happens. So, that's what we do here.
And on that note, Humphrey will have to leave it. Humphrey Hawksley, thank you for being with us. Also to Professor Patrick Vernon and Yvonne Ridley. Thank you to all of you. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and the team here, goodbye. Thank you for watching.